Okay, so this morning I'm starting with this second chapter I wrote in musicianship, improvising, and band and orchestra, 2018 book. My chapter 2, is called Improvisation and Instrumental Music, a Historical Perspective. Improvisation has been, is, and will continue to be important to instrumental music performance practice. It is important to many musical cultures and is present in school jazz ensembles, guitar classes, popular music ensembles, and steel bands. Improvisation facilitates students' self-expression and helps them understand other musicians' self-expression. Yet improvisation has not played a major role in school music education, especially large instrumental ensembles such as orchestras and concert bands. Improvisations, composed in real time, vary according to musical culture. Each ensemble taught in public schools, for instance, orchestras, concert bands, jazz ensembles, steel bands, percussion ensembles, popular music ensembles, can be understood as an extension of a musical culture that exists outside of school walls. Music education philosophers Eliot and Silverman wrote, "Improvisation is never a matter of an isolated activity. It's always a matter of contingency, dependent on the praxis in which the improvisation emerges." This perspective might explain that of Schull, who suggested that while concert bands are the center of musical activity, improvisation skills should be developed in jazz ensembles and stage bands. Instrumental improvisation can be taught in a variety of ensembles. For instance, steel band repertoire often leaves space for improvising on simple harmonic progressions. Because improvisational praxes, are dependent on musical cultures, each with histories and traditions of their own. A historical perspective is able to help teachers understand the current and potential uses of improvisation in schools. In this chapter, I will consider the practice of music improvisation in instrumental music from a historical perspective, to provide a broad historical understanding of instrumental music improvisation practice. I describe improvisation in Western music, early jazz musicians' learning experiences, instrumental improvisation learning in general music classes taught by Coleman, Moorhead, and Pond, and improvisation in the post-Sputnik era. These various expressions of instrumental improvisation can contextualize instrumental improvisation teaching. The purpose of this chapter is to provide descriptions of historical performance, teaching, and learning practices for teachers interested in employing improvisation activities in their orchestra and concert band programs for the first time, or to expand or diversify their current teaching practices. Context. Touring professional orchestras and bands were influential in introducing instrumental music to public schools. While orchestras maintained the tradition of the Old World, concert bands arose out of popularity among the American public. Orchestras such as the Theodore Thomas Orchestra and the concert bands of Patrick Gilmore and John Philip Sousa toured extensively in communities of all sizes, especially at amusement parks. This touring and interaction of school and industry led to school orchestras and later school bands becoming part of the public school curriculum in the early 20th century. Music education historians Mark and Gary suggest that development of contests, especially in the 1920s, led to standardization of band instrumentation, the practice of publishing full band scores instead of piano reductions, increased emphasis on instrumental music in teacher training programs, and a phenomenal growth in enrollment for school bands. Despite all of these positive consequences, it is possible that contests negatively affected the possibility of including improvisation in school instrumental music by standardizing written repertoire and solidifying how performances are judged to be successful. Improvisations are not easily judged and are not part of much written repertoire, especially that of late 19th and early 20th centuries. Improvisation was part of the Western music tradition from Gregorian chant through the 17th century organ extemporization to Baroque-era figured bass and ornamentation. It gradually lost favor with the ascendancy of the orchestral conductor, the composer's proxy, a living embodiment of the law, both positive and negative. As roles of composer and conductor overtook that of performer in Western music, improvisation lost prominence. It is interesting that by the time orchestras and concert bands gained standing in American public schools in the 1920s, improvisation as a performance practice had lost favor. Improvisation has, however, had a role in school music through jazz pedagogy. Dance, stage, and jazz bands entered public schools in the United States and Canada in the 1930s. Improvisation has at times been part of popular music pedagogy, which Humphreys indicates has been part of the music curriculum since the beginning of school music in the United States, but gained acceptance in 1968 with the Tanglewood Declaration. Of note is Green's popular music pedagogy, which employs improvisation extensively through integration of listening, performing, improvising, and composing, that began to take root in the 1990s. Alternatively, there has been improvisation instruction on instruments in general music classes. Many 20th century Western composers utilized improvisation, such as aleatoric elements. However, to take advantage of these ideal learning opportunities, orchestra and concert band teachers must understand how to teach improvisation. Keyes recommends that students explore sounds, learn to discover patterns, develop music communication skills, and acquire fluidity with strategies for improvising. This is consistent with other music pedagogues who suggest that it is important to use modeling and imitation, emphasize individual freedom within the musical structure, train the ear, and provide safe spaces for student exploration. Improvisation in Western music. In early Western music, learning improvisation along with learning to read music was common. As Aiello and Williamson wrote, until the 19th century, when musicians played in public, they either improvised the music or read from the score. Much of the Western music we teach, listen to, and perform in schools has an improvisational element. Bach, Handel, Mozart, and Beethoven were all renowned for their improvisational expertise. The types of keyboard improvisation they used, preludes, cadenzas, engage, continuo, independent extemporization, reached an apex in the 18th and early 19th century. Western improvisation practice contains many components teachers can incorporate, including national origin, for instance, French versus German ornamentation, style, expectations, and thematic development. Improvisational aspects of continuo performance varied by national style and individual composer. In the 18th and 19th centuries, fermatas were embellished and often noted an extended cadenza, consisting of style and content that should not conflict with those of the work or movement. Mozart's keyboard cadenzas from the early 1780s normally incorporate some thematic motivic connection with the relevant movement. According to Lawson and Stoll, cadenzas were improvised with melodic, harmonic, and metric structural expectations. String improvisers were allowed to improvise for an extended period of time, while wind players and singers were expected to limit improvisations to a single breath. Further, Levin argues Mozart's performances were designed to display his talents as improviser, pianist, and composer. That is the order his contemporaries assigned to his gifts. In the late classical and early romantic eras, expectations for substance in improvised cadenzas were expanded. Accordingly, Mozart notated different cadenzas for student use or for professional performance, and Beethoven's cadenzas demonstrated a much wider harmonic, tonal, and in some cases technical vocabulary than those of his predecessors. While examples of written improvisations can give a glimpse to the structural content, Lawson and Stoll suggested that improvisations were often designed by the performer to display unique expertise. Improvising based on Mozart's music requires the performer to study the entire composition, portraying the work's character. As the Romantic era developed, composers more often indicated specific notes for improvised passages. Stoll noted, quote, "The increasing trend was for composers to write out cadenzas in full, in order, either to guard against the technical excesses of virtuosity or to counteract the lack of invention displayed by many contemporary performers," end quote. However, to follow these practices in interpreting earlier works is problematic. Today's performances of Mozart work contain passages executed in a manner Mozart would have considered unacceptably incomplete. That's according to Levin. After writing about improvisation in the 18th and 19th centuries, Lawson and Stoll discussed improvisation in historical representation in the 20th century. While musicians were commonly expected to be competent improvisers in, for instance, Bach's lifetime, it seems that classical musicians had lost this sophistication by the 20th century. To perform music that included an improvisatory element, improvisation had to be relearned. Early steps to relearn improvisatory practice, especially due to Baroque music's repopularization in the mid-20th century, were difficult because what musicians had gained in technique, they had lost in sophistication, particularly in the realm of improvising. By considering the history of improvisation in Western music, instrumental music teachers might try to regain the practice of improvisation, especially when performing historical music, e.g. from the Baroque era. Ornamentations, which were often not notated in Baroque music, might provide an interesting pedagogical starting point. For instance, a young band performing 3 Bach miniatures might rehearse bourrée, minuet, and musette melodies using various ornamentations. Next, individual students could generate their own ornamentations, beginning with trills, starting a half step above the written note, and creatively exploring more complex ornamentations. After hearing a variety of students' ornamentations, the ensemble could settle on one interpretation. Improvisation in concert band literature. While most current large ensemble orchestra and concert band literature is through composed, some contains aleatoric sections. This type of composition practice can be noted in Holsinger's compositions for concert band, such as the Armies of the Omnipresent Outsurf, 1982, and In the Springtime, When Kings Go Off to War, 1991. The later composition includes instrumental and vocal improvisations with instructions such as begin slowly ad lib, improvised chaotic pitch display, and ad lib excel crescendo. Instructions include at time pitches and descriptions of scale on which to improvise. And here's figure 2-1, which I have. I took this picture down in Washington, D.C. at the NAFME archives. And it's an excerpt from Holsinger's In the Springtime from the American Bandmasters Association Research Center, University of Maryland. How's that? Doesn't that look fun? Both of the aforementioned compositions were Oswald composition winners. As such, high school and university ensembles perform them. These and other compositions with aleatoric elements are able to provide interesting entry points for improvisation pedagogy rooted in an ensemble tradition. Additionally, some music for younger bands includes space for improvisation. For instance, May's Reflexio e Danca is not aleatoric. Rather, it draws from Brazilian improvisation traditions. Experiences performing modern music with improvisational elements can help students develop greater musical fluidity and intrinsically understand 20th century idioms, as well as provide a forum for exploration and experimentation. However, it isn't always necessary to find existing aleatoric repertoire to teach improvisation in orchestra and concert band. Extending the concert band tradition, Herb recommends rewriting traditional repertoire to create improvisation activities. Herb provides examples of rhythm charts, scales for soloing, melody, harmonies, and bass lines for pieces of standard wind band repertoire. Improvisation can then become a way for students to learn musical elements of their current repertoire. As Herb states, quote, "By taking a piece apart and being able to put it back together in many different ways, students will gain a better understanding of why the composer or arranger decided to put it together his or her particular way." End quote. Improvisation provides an opportunity for a reciprocal relationship. Not only do students improve as improvisers, but improvisation activities also help them better understand the repertoire they are performing. Early descriptions of jazz learning. Early jazz musicians were enculturated to a highly improvisatory instrumental practice. Autobiographies and biographies, such as those of Louis Armstrong, Sidney Bechet, and Baby Todd's, provide interesting insight into learning improvisation through enculturation rather than in a school setting. Armstrong and Bechet describe the importance of having other musicians in their family. These musicians exposed them informally to improvised music. Church music was important in Armstrong and Dodd's early musical experiences, as it exposed them to a large number of songs. Knowing a collection of standards is important to learning jazz improvisation. It is also important to other improvisation traditions. Listening to other improvising musicians is also an important part of learning to improvise. Jelly Roll Morton described listening to brass marches as important to his learning. Quote, "Music was pouring into the streets from every house," end quote. For Armstrong, listening to improvisations from the sidewalk helped him learn to distinguish the difference between Buddy Bolden, King Oliver, and Bunk Johnson. Listening to recordings of many of these same musicians is still a major part of teaching and learning jazz improvisation, and it approximates enculturation in a school setting. It may be possible for music educators to recreate more aspects of enculturation, such as lowering stakes, facilitating criticism-free environments, and learning a collection of standard melodies by ear in a school setting. Instrumental improvisation in early general music classes. The music education profession has gained much from instrumental improvisation in general music classes. However, it seems that pedagogical approaches in general and instrumental music teachers have separated. Some improvisation pedagogy, such as Orff and Kodai, can be viewed as pertinent in general music specialists, while others, such as jazz pedagogy, are appropriate for instrumental music teachers. Still others, such as Gordon's music learning theory, offer written pedagogical material for both general and instrumental music applications. In the 1920s, when orchestras and concert bands were beginning to take root in the U.S. schools, music education generalist Sadis Coleman formulated her approach to creative music making while working in New York City's Lincoln Lab School and Teachers College at Columbia University. Her progressive, democratic, student-centered approach involved instrument construction, singing, dancing, playing instruments, using number notation, and improvising, with the aim being to cultivate creative and spiritually fulfilled children. Coleman felt it was important to teach improvisation at a young age, forming the habit of improvising. Though she wrote that her work does not attempt to support or discuss the once popular recapitulation theory, she did believe in a natural evolution of music, from simple to complex, with implications for constructing and introducing instruments and introducing musical elements such as rhythm and melody. Her students performed on a variety of instruments because she believed such experiences could lead to generalizations which are full of meaning. She believed in delaying technical training on instruments with young students to facilitate improvising improvisation, stating, "The spontaneity of one's playing always suffers when technique has to be considered." Coleman postulated that after building a habit of joyful music making and a disposition of inquiry, a desire to practice and develop technique, as well as a focus on a single instrument, emerges naturally. In the 1930s and 40s, the Pillsbury Foundation provided composer Donald Pond and music educator Gladys Moorhead funds to observe and document children's natural music expressions. One part of the project included providing students opportunities to play with musical instruments from around the world. Pond and Moorhead's process included allowing students time to improvise on instruments. And I do have a figure here for that. I didn't print very well. But it has some descriptions, right, of what the kids are doing. In this project, young children were most interested in aspects of timbre as opposed to pitch or rhythm in their improvisations. In line with Coleman's creative music approach described above, the students were free to take up or discard instruments and performed on a variety of instruments. Further, instrumental performance and play were interconnected. Instrumental music educators, especially in elementary schools, might learn from the children's preference for timbre by allowing students to experiment on a variety of instruments, and spontaneity and technique development might be given equal priority during early instrumental learning so that students can cultivate spontaneity. Such activities highlight the playful spirit of exploration fundamental to childhood learning. It can be read there better in the book. For instance, experiment with rhythm, dance sticks, holes, and blocks, making sound when lifting and push downward. Right. Other kids have an animal game, discard instruments, except Douglas, who becomes animal but continues to play the J drum. Whatever that is. Okay, improvisation in curricula after Sputnik. As has been noted by many historians, Sputnik's launch led to many curricular reforms in the United States. Cultivating creative citizens became important. With a renewed interest in creativity, teaching improvisation became important. In music education, the Manhattanville Music Curriculum Project, MMCP, treated children as creative musicians, guiding them through free exploration, guided exploration, exploratory improvisation, planned improvisation, and refinement. In an example of an MMCP summer workshop, composer Lionel Nowak scraped and tapped with his fingers and his pipe on a desk, an ashtray, a metal wastebasket, and Venetian blinds to demonstrate to students the world of sound around us. The students then created 2-minute compositions with those found sounds. In the early 1960s, Music Educators National Conference, financed by a 6-year grant from the Ford Foundation, sponsored the Contemporary Music Project, CMP, for creative music education. The Joint Committee of CMP began meeting in 1963 to discuss policies for the placement of young composers in public secondary school systems, for seminars and workshops to bring composers and music educators together at educational institutions and provide music centers, and for pilot experiments in improvisation and creativity by students in elementary and secondary schools. Early seminars took place in Ithaca College, the Aspen Music School, University of Wichita, and the Berkshire Music Center, with pilot projects in Baltimore, Maryland, and San Diego, California. Guided by these programs, music educators became interested in techniques composers were using, such as found sounds. In the early 1970s, the Improvisatory Music Project, IMP, performed improvised music at workshops and lecture concerts in school assemblies in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania region. IMP performed at Germantown People's Festival and recorded a 60-minute radio program as well as a television segment. Based on the premise that the great art of serious improvising has indeed essentially been lost, IMP endeavored to go far beyond jazz improvisation. To do this, IMP tried to remove traditional restrictions on a performer, such as the tonal key relationship. Modeling an improvisatory practice from historical classical performers, IMP had students perform rhythmic or melodic motifs during school assemblies on which IMP performers improvised compositions. IMP does not seem to have been a long-lived program, but perhaps it inspired future generations of creative music educators. This tradition is being carried on by organizations such as the Institute for Creative Music, which collaborates with schools, churches, and community centers to enable students to experience musical fundamentals, improvisation, and technology. Discussion. This chapter presents some historical practices of improvisation within and pertinent to instrumental music education. To accomplish the purpose of this chapter, I describe improvisational traditions in Western music, aleatoric music in concert band literature, early jazz learning, instrumental improvisation in general music classrooms of Coleman, Moorhead, and Pond, and improvisation in music education curricula after Sputnik. It is hoped that these descriptions provide ideas to orchestra and concert band teachers who might expand or diversify their current teaching practices. Particularly, this chapter contends that improvisation practices can be used as they arise in existing historical instrumental music praxis. As such, this chapter represents a conservative ethos, conserving creative musical traditions and exploring possibilities for reestablishing them in current practice. Rather than turning away from tradition, a return to commonly overlooked but vigorously musical aspects of instrumental music tradition is recovered and revitalized. Improvisational tradition in Western music, including aleatoric music performance by orchestras and concert bands today, may provide a sense of urgency for finding meaningful approaches to teaching improvisation. To perform improvised music, as with any music, it is important to perform it well. Consequently, improvisation should be a central element of instrumental music education. Early descriptions of prominent jazz figures offer insight into learning experiences that led to a lifetime of instrumental improvisation achievement. Descriptions of instrumental music in historic general music classrooms might provide insight, especially for elementary orchestra and concert band teachers, but they provide understanding of how young children understand improvised instrumental music. Also, descriptions of improvisation in music curricula in the 1960s and 70s provide insight into curricular understandings during a time in which creative teaching practices were becoming important to music education profession. Such insights into pedagogic practice might include emphasizing timbre, such as exploring sounds for inexperienced improvisers, focusing on rhythmic improvisation, modeling enculturation in the instrumental classroom, building a body of repertoire and patterns for improvising, and allowing improvisation activities to become reciprocal learning experiences. With these emphases, students can learn to improvise, and also, through improvising, they reciprocally learn to better understand and perform in instrumental music ensembles.